Hey there. So if you're taking an introductory biology course in college this semester, or maybe you're taking AP Bio, this video is the place to start because this really talks about all of the different things that you need to know to really understand the details of what you're going to be learning about throughout the course of the semester. Now, sometimes this college class is called something like Bio 1, maybe it's called General Principles of Biology or Introductory Biology. But essentially, throughout the semester, you're going to be learning about biology. And biology is the study of life. And sometimes it's easy to lose the forest for the trees, if you've heard of that saying. In biology, you focus so much on all the details and learning the details, and there are a lot of details, that sometimes you forget about the big picture. And so this video is going to talk about the big picture, about what it is to be alive. So what is life? We know when we look at this picture that the frog is alive, but the rock it's sitting on is not alive. So what is it about living things that allows us to characterize them as living rather than not living, like this rock, for instance? So if you can, pause the video and try to jot down a few things that maybe are characteristics that all living things have that non-living things do not have. Go ahead, pause the video. Okay, did you pause the video? Hopefully you had a chance to do so. Well, there are 7 different criteria that to be alive, a living thing must satisfy. And the first criterion is that living organisms have order. Within them, they have order. And on the earth, they're arranged in a hierarchy. Well, what is a hierarchy? A hierarchy is simply sort of an ordering system of different structures. Okay, so for instance, one type of hierarchy, we know this is a frog, but a frog is also an amphibian. And then an amphibian is also an animal, right? So we can create these hierarchies of different stages and different layers and levels to try to organize all life here on Earth and the interaction of life with the environment. The second characteristic that all living things must possess in order to be considered alive is that living organisms have biological instructions for building complex structures. So within their cells, they have these instructions, and I bet you know what those instructions are called. They're called DNA, right? Deoxyribonucleic acid. All living things have DNA within their cells. So that's a characteristic that a living thing has to possess as well. This rock, for instance, does not have any DNA, right? The third characteristic of living things is that living organisms have to be able to gather energy and materials from their surroundings, from the environment, and then they use those energy and materials to maintain themselves, to grow, and to repair themselves. So this frog, for instance, if this frog, needs more energy, it might eat a fly that's going by, something like that. It might need to repair something because it got a cut or a scratch or something like that. The rock, on the other hand, is not going to be able to gather things from the environment and use them to grow, repair itself, or maintain itself. Now, the fourth characteristic of living things, there are 7, so we're halfway through. The fourth is that living organisms engage in interactions, both within each cell and with other organisms. So within each cell, there are different proteins and molecules interacting with each other so that the cell can actually carry on and maintain itself, repair itself. But also we know that living organisms are part of food webs. So they interact with other organisms as well. So as I mentioned, this frog, it interacts with flies because it will snap out its tongue and grab a fly and then eat it and digest it for energy. So living organisms engage in interactions, and that's within each cell of the living organism, but also organism to organism. Now, the fifth characteristic that a living organism has to possess is that living organisms must compensate for changes in their environment. That means that, they have to be able to have things within the living organism that help them compensate for things that are outside of the organism. So here's an example you probably know. Let's say you go outside, it's really, really hot. Well, what does your body start doing to compensate? it starts sweating, right? And hopefully what happens is that the sweat evaporates, and as it evaporates, it pulls heat from your body, thereby cooling you and your skin. So that's an example of how living organisms can compensate for changes in the environment. But even single-celled organisms like bacteria, for instance, are only one cell big. They have to be able to compensate for changes too. Like if they're put in an environment that has a lot of water molecules or high salt molecules, they have to have mechanisms to compensate as well. Now, the sixth characteristic of living things is that they grow, develop, and reproduce. We know this rock, for instance, isn't going to be able to grow. It's not going to develop into anything else. It's not going to be able to make baby rocks, right? But living organisms have the ability to grow, develop their structure, their organism, and to reproduce, to create the next generation of that particular species. And that could be a frog like this. That could be humans. That can also be single-celled organisms like bacteria that start as one cell and split into two cells. That's through a process known as binary fission. Well, we'll talk about that in a different video. Now, the final characteristic that living organisms possess is that the structure and function of living organisms can change from one generation to the next. So we're talking about generations here, okay? We're talking about the population of humans or the population of frogs. From each generation to the next generation to the next generation, there may be small changes, very small changes within the next generation. And these small changes are caused by mutations in the DNA. And so over long periods of time, hundreds or thousands of generations, you might be able to see that that population of living organisms is different a little bit than the population maybe 100 generations ago. So, again, we're not talking about the individual, right? We're not talking about this individual frog, or we're not talking about me, for instance, but we're talking about the population of humans or the population of frogs from generation to generation to generation. And you might wonder, well, are humans still changing? This process, this gradual process is called evolution. And are humans as a population still evolving? Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you one example. Head size. Head size is actually getting a little bit larger this generation than it was 100 generations ago or 1,000 generations ago. So these are the 7 criteria that a living organism has to be able to satisfy in order to be considered alive. And we certainly know there are biological things out there that satisfy some of these, but are not considered to be alive. Can you think of one? Okay, I'll give you one. Viruses. Viruses are not actually alive. They're not living. And you know why? It's because they do not satisfy all of these criteria at the moment. So certainly they satisfy some of them, right? We know that viruses, for instance, have biological instructions, like DNA, for instance. We know that the structure and function of living of viruses can change from one generation to the next. Viruses evolve. We see that with HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus. We see that with SARS coronavirus, how it's continually having mutations and evolving. But viruses do not satisfy all of these. For instance, viruses cannot gather energy and materials from their surroundings. When they're outside of the cell, they're inert. They can't do anything. They're just little physical particles when they're outside of a cell. So, nope, they can't do that on their own. They can't gather energy and materials from their environment. They also can't compensate for changes in their environment. So if they happen to end up in a really hot environment, they have no way to compensate. So that's an example of something we would call a biological entity. It is involved in biology. Certainly viruses play a huge role and relationship with living things, but they're not actually considered to be alive. To be alive, a living organism has to satisfy all of these criteria. Now, these 7 characteristics can also be put into what we call themes of life. Okay, there are 5 unifying themes of life, and here they are. The themes of life are organization, information, energy and matter, interactions, and evolution. So we also can think of how these characteristics of life fit into these themes. And if you're taking a Bio 1 class in college, you're going to see that the things that you're studying, all of those details, really fall into one of these 5 themes. Again, take a step back, because this is where we often lose the forest for the trees. What does that mean? It means that we forget the big picture because we're focused on the minute details. But everything you learn in a biology class in college is going to fit and help to explain one of these themes or one of these characteristics of living things. You know, you're going to learn about biological molecules. You're going to learn about cellular respiration and metabolism. You're going to learn about cell division and evolution. Those topics, which have a lot of details, are going to fit into one of these characteristics, because what you're learning about things about life, right? You're learning all the details about what it means to be living and how living things carry out all the things that are required of them. Okay, so if we think about these themes, though, we also can take these criteria and organize them into the various themes. So if you have a minute, stop the video and see if you can go through these 7 criteria and figure out which theme or themes, because sometimes that criteria can fit into more than one, but which themes each criteria would fit into. Okay, so let's go over it together then, okay? Living organisms have order and are arranged in a hierarchy. Well, that seems like organization, so that would fall into the organization theme. The second criterion, living organisms have biological instructions for building complex structures. Well, that's DNA, and that would fit into information. Living organisms must gather energy and materials from the surroundings to maintain themselves, grow, and repair. Well, that would fit into the energy and matter theme. The fourth criterion, living organisms engage in interactions. Well, that quite clearly falls into the interactions theme of biology. The fifth, living organisms must compensate for changes in their environment. Well, this one could fall into a couple different things, right? It could fall into energy and matter, because they're essentially, if you're trying to give off heat, or if you're trying to maintain an environment within the cell or within the organism, that's going to require energy. It also might have to do with interactions, because it's the interaction of the living organism with the physical environment. Living organisms grow, reproduce, and develop. Well, that could fit into several of these. It could fit into energy and matter. It could fit into interactions between biological organisms for reproduction. And the final criterion, the structure and function of living organisms can change from one generation to the next. Well, that leads to the process of evolution, where different populations of organisms, again, not the individual, but the population, can have small changes over time. Okay, that's evolution. So when you're dealing with all of the details of biology, and there are a lot, I admit, think back to these things and why you're learning about them. Well, you're learning about all the details of what it is to be alive and how living things happen and continue to happen. Now, be sure to subscribe to my channel, because I'll be putting out new videos every week that are going to talk about all the details and really help to break down these complicated subjects that we find in biology. So things like DNA replication, or what biological molecules are, a little bit of chemistry, because chemistry is really important in biology, evolution, cell division, things like that. Each week I'll be releasing a new video that helps to break down these complicated topics.